If one spends a great deal of time traveling the roads from Tasmarine to Verandine, they are no doubt familiar with the musician called Wonderful, Marvelous, and Strange, known to most as the great bard Everard. This afternoon he journeyed on the road to the green city Verandine. The talented performer had been roving for several days, and being a man of social distinction and a lover of good company, he found himself lamenting that, at present, he had none. The musician would stop along his trip to refresh his stamina and good humor, and afterward would pull the fiddle from his back and play a song or two for an imaginary crowd before packing up and setting off on his way. This day, however, as he reached for his instrument, the musician froze as the telltale sound of a twig snapping broke the silence in the shadows nearby. The performer made no sudden movements. "Ho there," he said, though he remained seated on the tree stump next to his campfire and took note of the location of his walking staff. "You've been following me for some time yet. Care to introduce yourself?" Out of the dappled gloom stepped an ancient, raggedy wolf. "Just an old dog looking to learn a new trick," came the grizzled voice. Alas, it was only an old beast and not the conversation partner the musician had had in mind. "Have you come to eat me, then?" laughed the musician, resting one elbow on his knee, and giving the wolf a wave of his hand as if beckoning him closer. "That's one trick you'll only try once." The wolf shrunk in stature, perhaps offended at the musician's mischaracterization of him. "Eat you? Why, no, I don't want to eat you. I want to know how you play so well. You make it look so easy. I thought maybe you'd be able to teach me." The musician, amused beyond words, shook his head laughing and stood to gather his things. He insisted to the wolf that he hadn't the time to teach him, and that he really had best be going. But the shaggy old canine padded along after him, suggesting that he might learn by observation, that he had endless stories to share in return, and that he wouldn't make himself a nuisance. Still, the musician was quite convinced that the wolf was far too old and useless to be the companion he was seeking. It wasn't very long at all before the musician grew tired of the wolf's questions about his art as they traveled. In actuality, the wolf had begun by inquiring about music, but soon the conversation inevitably turned to questions about humans. How many pups in a litter, he asked, and did he have to prepare for the cold, harsh winters? Was it tools alone that offered the human an advantage, or something else? In his day, the wolf mused, tooth and claw were enough. The musician wondered how he might be rid of the wolf, for he was certainly too far along in age to learn anything new at this point in his life. Perhaps if he'd been paying attention, the musician might have noticed that the wolf guided him through a tricky section of the wood which he'd found difficult to navigate before. Nevertheless, the musician felt that perhaps he should not have wished so hard for a companion, as now he'd surely prefer to have remained on his own. For now, he wanted to be alone with his thoughts again. "Here, wolf, see here," he said, coming to a stop near a hollowed-out old oak tree. "I've changed my mind. Let's have your first lesson. I'll show you how I learned to hold a fiddle." He directed the old wolf to place his paws into a cleft in the trunk, and when the mangy beast had obeyed, the musician jammed into the remaining space a sharp stone that pinned the wolf fast. He was stuck, and the musician waved goodbye, leaving the old wolf behind. Though the beast was disappointed and angry, he could only shake his head. Everard strode past and left the wolf without a single glance backward. "Farewell, Sir Wolf, but I'm in want of good company and I'll be moving on alone." The musician pushed on into the cool shade of the forest well into the early evening, and soon it was time to take a rest. Almost as quickly as he had pulled out his fiddle and begun to play, the musician found himself once again interrupted by a noisy denizen of the wood. A small fox bounded into his path, bristling with the energy and curiosity of youth. "I knew it was you, the great bard Everard, walking in the very forest where I live," the fox exclaimed. "Please, you must teach me to play. You won't find a bigger fan anywhere else in the kingdom." "Here we go again," said the musician, crossing his arms over his chest. "Look here, young fox, not even the citizens of Tasmarine hound me for free lessons the way you beasts of the forest do. What makes you think I have the time?" The fox scurried up a small hill and gave the musician a toothy smile. "Maybe you don't have the time, but I do. Let me follow you along on your way and I'll learn by watching. I've got ideas you'd never think of in your whole life." Doubtful, the musician thought, but knowing there was no way out of this impromptu arrangement without resorting to deception or violence, he begrudgingly accepted. Resigned to the fate his errant wish seemed to have wrought, the musician sighed and waved the fox ahead. "Very well, young fox, we're off," he said. but he was certain that the fox was too frivolous and too full of mischief to be any kind of use to him. In even shorter measure than before, the musician found himself eager to be rid of his animal companion. The fox's questions were even more inane. How many days old was he when he learned to play the fiddle? Was it hard having 20 digits, and why were some of them called toes? Did the toes ever come into play, and why did humans have extra ones on their front paws anyway? The musician and the fox came to a low path surrounded by tall bushes on both sides. At once the man devised a scheme that would free him of the fox's company. Maybe if he had been paying attention, the musician might have noticed the kick in his step that had arrived since the little fox had begun traveling with him. Still, he resolved to be rid of the beast. "Here now, Sir Fox," he said, stopping and gesturing towards his feet. "I've changed my mind after all. Let's have your first lesson. If you obey my instructions, I'll show you how to hold a bow." The fox bounded in a circle in his excitement, then stood obediently at the feet of the musician. The musician took in hand the tops of 2 small saplings on either side of the path, bringing them down to his feet and instructing the fox to hold them in place. When the fox did so, the musician pulled from his pockets 2 loops of ribbon and quickly tied the fox's paws to the saplings. When he let go, the fox sprung up into the air, dangling by its paws and immediately staring the musician down with regret and disappointment. "Why would you trick me?" the fox yelped. "Farewell, Sir Fox, but I'm in want of good company and I'll be moving on alone." The moon rose into clear skies that night, but the musician still had much journeying to do. He preferred traveling in the light of the moon, which may or may not have had something to do with how he enjoyed sleeping in the mornings. Even so, his feet did begin to ache, and soon he would be eager to stop for the night. He hoped he might find some combination of a companion, ale, dinner, and a warm bed. He paused in a clearing near a fork in the road, which turned toward a small hamlet to the south. Taking a few minutes to have a sip of wine and play his fiddle in the quiet of the evening, the musician once again found himself longing for a peer to engage in conversation with. As he was deciding whether to make his own camp here or travel a little out of the way to spend the night in civilized quarters, the musician nearly fell off his seat when a frantic hare scrambled out of the dark bushes right in front of him. His fiddle whined with a brief, ear-splitting screech at the hare's sudden appearance. The hare briefly beheld him, eyes wide with terror, but when she saw the musician's fine garments and the instrument slung over his back, she heaved a sigh of relief. "Oh, you're not the woodsman, thank stars," she said. "I heard you playing, and I ran in the direction of the sound as fast as my feet could carry me." "Well," the musician said warily, "you would seem to be safe now, so goodbye." "Safe? Oh, I'm never safe," the hare remarked, so matter-of-fact that the musician wondered if she was even bothered. "No, that's not it. I came running because I've been hoping you'd teach me to play the fiddle like you." "Oh, for heaven's sake," the musician said under his breath. Once again he insisted against it, but the hare wouldn't take no for an answer, even though the only thing she had to offer in return was a laundry list of worries that stretched on into the hundreds. The musician begrudgingly carried on, now determined to make it to the nearby town. He presumed that the innkeeper would chase his hoppity companion away lest she be caught for someone's supper, and he might at least be free of inane chatter when it came time to rest for tomorrow's journey. The hare kept asking for a lesson, and the musician would insist he was still thinking about it. The hare's questions were unceasing. Did humans, like hares, have predators living amongst them? Did danger lurk in every corner? Was existence a constant struggle between life and death? Did he enjoy the little things every chance he could? Had he been less preoccupied with ridding himself of the hare, perhaps he'd have appreciated how her vigilant ears warned them both of danger as they traveled. But as it was, he did not, and he at last found a chance to escape her company. He waited until the hare was busy nibbling on a thistle bush and crept further down the path, pulling a loose strand of twine from his pocket, attaching one to the tip of a short fir tree and holding the other out to the hare. "Look here, Dame Hare," he said, beckoning. "I've changed my mind. If you do as I say, I'll show you how I string a bow." He looped one end of the twine around the hare's neck and stepped back. "Now quickly race around the tree as many times as you can." The hare kicked off and began racing around the tree, until a moment later she had managed to tether herself to the trunk and could not get free of the cord. "Unbelievable," the hare muttered, wriggling. "It's true, humans can't be trusted." The musician doffed his hat to the miserable beast and bowed. "Farewell, Dame Hare, but I'm in want of good company and I'll be moving on alone." Miles further back on the road, the old wolf was still fighting to loose his paws from the cleft in the hollow oak. Weakened with age but bolstered by anger, The shaggy beast threw its full weight into the base of the tree until the sharp stone shook loose and he was able to pull one paw from the crevice. Closer to Verandine, the musician had decided he would push on to the inn. He didn't want the beast he'd met on the road to give him any further trouble. Still, that warm bed was some distance away, and if he was being honest with himself, his encounters in the wood with the three odd beasts had inspired a new melody. He feared if he did not play it that he might lose it, so the musician pulled the fiddle from his pack and began to play. The wolf took off down the lone road winding through the forest with a speed that had evaded him for decades. As he raced along following the faint scent of muddy leather boots and, soap, he came to a sudden dusty stop at the sound of a voice calling out, "Good wolf, cut me free! That cursed magician has betrayed me!" The wolf came to the aid of the little fox without a moment's hesitation, and the two took off racing down the starlit road. Elsewhere, the gifted musician plucked and strummed, improvising his newest tune as he walked along. He wasn't aware he drew near to the cottage of the woodsman, but naturally enough the voice of his instrument carried on the wind and caught the man's attention from inside. The woodsman soon emerged and waved a greeting. Likewise, the musician welcomed the first human face he'd seen all day and was delighted to invite the man to have a seat and listen. Overjoyed and charmed by the enchanting tones he'd heard singing through the wood, the woodsman removed his hat and sat, transfixed by the musician's beautiful music. Back in the dark wood, Fox and Wolf raced with the wind in their fur until they came upon Hare in a predicament much as they had both just escaped. "Oh, stars, I'm trapped! Curse that musician and his fiddle, too!" the hare cried out, and attempted to scrabble up the trunk of the tree, only to be yanked back to earth. As Wolf and Fox approached with cautious curiosity, they heard her curse the name of the self-same musician who had caused them both such misery. "Steady now, Long-Ears," the wolf said, slowing his approach. "Did you say something about that wandering musician who travels the road from Verandine to Tasmarine?" Shivering, the hare gave the approaching predators a slow and uneasy nod. Yes, he was going to teach me to play the fiddle, but he tricked me into tying myself to this tree." The little fox bounded over to the hare, who flinched quite dramatically, but with a snip-snap of his powerful jaws the twine was cut and the smaller creature was freed. She looked perplexed as she shook off the twine, but the fox and the wolf saw gratitude there. The three of them agreed to follow the musician's trail and do him some mischief, the specifics of which they would decide on the way. The musician had played the full piece in its entirety and had just begun to improvise, though his audience of one still sat, enraptured by his playing. However, maybe the musician had allowed himself to go too long since the last time he'd had the bow restrung, because the performance was cut short when the fibers humming along the fiddle's neck suddenly snapped. The woodsman blinked as though emerging from a trance. Across from him, the musician heaved a dramatic sigh and examined his broken bow. "Suppose it's a good thing I'm headed into town, then," he said. "Ah, you don't need to go that far this late," said the woodsman. "For that lovely music, I can fix that bow up for you and offer you a spot in the barn to sleep while I do it." While the bard could think of several other places he'd prefer to sleep than on a pile of straw, downwind of chickens and an old nag, he was admittedly fatigued, and the archetier in town would charge him stiffly to repair the bow, perhaps more than he might even make for the rest of the evening if the repairs were done quickly. No, reluctant as he was, the musician would have to accept the woodsman's kind, if provincial, offer. "Very well, then," the musician said. As though answering him, a solemn howl rang out from the forest, and the two men stopped in their tracks. The howl came again, and this time others accompanied it from somewhere deep in the woods. And all at once there came a frightful yelping that sounded almost human, like an evil witch's laugh, and a low pattering that sounded like drum beats in the earth. The bard found himself gripped with fear. He felt the woodsman push him aside to step between him and the eerie presence lurking in the trees. The man hoisted his axe and called out, "Whatever demon you be, I will cast you from this place." The cacophony ceased at once. The two men stood frozen on the hill, too afraid to look away from the road, but both knowing it might be best to turn and run. Just then, the unholy noise started up again, louder, and the two men wasted no time in turning back and charging up the hill. Halfway there, the bard caught his foot on a loose root and tripped. He couldn't seem to scramble back to his feet, but after a few hapless seconds of panic, he was surprised to hear the racket had once again fallen quiet. The woodsman doubled back and reached out to the other man with one hand to help him up, urging him to hurry. It was then that the two men heard sudden peals of laughter coming from the trees next to the road. Then 3 figures emerged. I don't know much about humans, but I know what being scared out of your wits looks like, called the wolf, shaking his head with reserved amusement. The woodsman held his axe aloft. What is the meaning of this? He shouted. The man you're offering shelter to would rather put someone's life in danger than be slightly inconvenienced, the hare said. She approached the woodsman cautiously, but kept a safe distance. He put each of us at risk to be rid of us, when he might just as easily have told us the truth. What my friend here means, said the wolf, from behind the hare, is that you're taking an untrustworthy person into your house. The woodsman, apparently comprehending the events that had just transpired, cast a skeptical glance at his human companion. He looked from the broken bow to the odd assortment of animals this traveler had allegedly wronged. After a moment, the woodsman appeared to have decided he was done with the whole affair as he began walking back up the hill towards his house without another word. The musician turned to follow, but the woodsman quickly corrected him. You'll be heading on to Verandine tonight, then, he said, indicating the direction of town with a jet of his chin. The bard furrowed his brow, his eyes and mouth wide with surprise. What? Why? Resting his axe against one shoulder, the woodsman shook his head and laughed. You brought a wolf to my door and didn't warn me. Isn't that enough? And my bow? Asked the musician, hands on his hips. Tell the bow maker he still owes me for lumber. The wolf, the fox, and the hare sat to watch the woodsman's silhouette disappear over the hill. They shared a measure of delight in noting how the musician trudged away down the road, fatigued and somewhat embarrassed. Maybe next time he comes through he'll respect us, the young fox said. Doubtful, said the hare, but now he'll be civil. The animals said their goodbyes on the road and headed their separate ways, and thereafter, when they saw one another, they would remember the sight of the musician falling prey to their mischief and would begin laughing together all over again.